Picture this. You're sitting in your kitchen reaching into a bag of dried figs or sweetened cranberries, the snack you've trusted for years because the label says, no sugar added. But broad clinical observations tracking adults aged 50 to 75 show something unsettling. Some popular dried fruits can quietly push blood sugar markers higher than a slice of cake with zero symptoms warning you it's happening. Mainstream advice calls dried fruit a healthy swap. But what if that swap is the very thing keeping your A1C stuck? Dr. Rubio Santner, Metabolic Health Simplified, has been tracking exactly which dried fruits are working against you and which ones may actually help. And when we hit number 6, there's a tiny seed that could change your snack drawer forever. So tell me, what's sitting in your pantry right now? Drop it below, because today we're going through it together, starting with the one hiding in plain sight. Number 1. Let's start with what's happening behind the scenes, because this is the part most people never get explained to them in a way that actually makes sense. Your A1C number isn't measuring what you ate this morning. It's measuring an average, a kind of report card of your blood sugar over roughly the last 3 months. And here's the part that catches so many people off guard. Data tracked by the CDC suggests that small, repeated blood sugar spikes, the kind that don't make you feel dizzy, shaky, or unwell, can still accumulate quietly over time, nudging that 3-month average upward without any obvious daily warning sign. Think of it like a slow leak in a tire. You don't notice it day to day. The tire still looks fine when you glance at it, but 3 months later, you're driving on something dangerously low, and you never felt the moment it happened. This is exactly why a small handful of dried fruit, eaten almost on autopilot, can matter so much more than it seems. It's not one snack. It's the pattern, repeated day after day, often without any sensation that something is off. Now pause right here for a second. If you've ever felt completely fine after a snack, only to be told later that your numbers had crept up, this is likely part of the explanation. Clinical models suggest this kind of invisible accumulation is one of the more underestimated factors in long-term metabolic markers for adults in the 50 to 75 range. So with that foundation in place, let's look at exactly which dried fruits tend to contribute to this pattern the most, starting with one that's sitting in pantries across the country right now, often labeled as one of the healthiest choices on the shelf. Number 2. Figs have a reputation problem most people don't even know about, because that reputation works in their favor, at least on the surface. Fresh figs are genuinely nutritious. They carry fiber, potassium, and a gentle natural sweetness that the body tends to handle reasonably well. But here's where things shift. When a fig is dried, the water disappears, and everything else gets concentrated into a much smaller package. The sugar that was once spread across a juicy piece of fruit is now packed tightly into a chewy, bite-sized version of itself. The American Diabetes Association has highlighted that portion size becomes especially important with dried fruits precisely because of this concentration effect. A small handful can carry a sugar load that would normally require eating several times that amount of the fresh version. Here's the everyday analogy that makes this click. Imagine concentrating an entire glass of orange juice down into just a few tablespoons. You'd still be drinking all that sugar, just in a smaller, easier to overconsume form. Dried figs work the same way. 3 or 4 pieces can feel like just a snack, while delivering a sugar load closer to what you'd get from a much larger serving of fresh fruit. This matters because dried figs are often marketed and perceived as a natural alternative to candy. And in some ways, that's true. But natural doesn't always mean low impact for blood sugar, especially when portions aren't carefully measured. The practical takeaway here isn't to fear figs entirely. It's about recognizing that a few dried figs are not nutritionally equivalent to a few fresh figs and adjusting accordingly. But figs aren't the only dried fruit hiding a sugar story behind a health-conscious label. The next one might be even sneakier, because this one often has sugar added on top of what's already naturally there. Number 3, this next one is sneaky for a different reason, and it catches even careful eaters off guard. Fresh cranberries are naturally tart, almost unpleasantly so if eaten plain, And that tartness is actually a clue to something good. Cranberries in their natural state are quite low in sugar compared to most fruits. But because that natural tartness is hard for most people to enjoy, the dried versions you find on grocery shelves are almost always sweetened, often with added sugar or concentrated fruit juice to make them palatable. Mayo Clinic has noted that this kind of added sugar processing is one of the more common ways naturally low-sugar foods can shift into a very different category once dried and packaged for shelf appeal. Here's the analogy that tends to land. Imagine taking a naturally unsweetened cup of black coffee, then sweetening it heavily before serving it to you, but keeping the label focused on coffee, with no mention of how much sugar was stirred in. The cranberries themselves haven't changed. What's been added to make them enjoyable has. This creates what we might call a double layer effect. The natural sugars that were already modest, now sitting on top of additional sweeteners, all concentrated into a small, dried, easy-to-snack-on form. A handful that feels like a tart, fruity treat can carry a sugar profile far closer to candy than most people would ever guess from the ingredient label's front-facing claims. Now pause for a moment here. If you've ever reached for dried cranberries, specifically because cranberries themselves have a healthy reputation, you're not alone. That reputation is earned for the fresh fruit. It doesn't always transfer to the dried, sweetened version sitting in the bag. And this brings us to perhaps the cleverest disguise of all, a snack that combines several ingredients in a way that makes the whole thing very difficult to evaluate at a glance. Number 4. This one might be the most common blind spot of all, because it doesn't look like a single food. It looks like a thoughtful, balanced choice. Trail mix has built its reputation on variety. Nuts, seeds, dried fruit, sometimes a few chocolate pieces, all combined into something that feels inherently wholesome simply because it contains a little bit of everything. And to be fair, some of those individual ingredients genuinely are supportive choices on their own. But Johns Hopkins Medicine has pointed out that combination foods like trail mix can be particularly difficult to evaluate because the dried fruit portion, often raisins, dried cranberries, or banana chips, tends to be the most calorie-dense and sugar-concentrated part of the mix, while the nuts and seeds create a sense of balance that can mask just how much of that sugary portion is actually being eaten. Here's a simple way to picture it. Imagine a plate with a small salad next to a generous slice of cake, and someone hands you the whole plate as dinner. Technically, there's something healthy on that plate, but the overall meal isn't defined by the salad. It's defined by what makes up the bulk of what you're actually consuming. Trail mix can work the same way. The handful you grab might be mostly the dried fruit and sweetened pieces with just a few nuts mixed in, even though your brain registers the whole handful as the healthy mix. There's also the issue of portion blindness. Because trail mix is designed to be eaten by the handful, and because it doesn't feel like a dessert, people often eat it more freely than they would a clearly sugary snack, sometimes without ever checking the label for added sugars in the dried fruit component. This is the third piece of the puzzle, and together with figs and sweetened cranberries, it paints a picture of how easily small, repeated choices can quietly stack up. So now let's connect this back to something bigger. What this pattern, over time, may actually mean for your cardiovascular system. Number 5. So far, we've focused on blood sugar specifically. But there's a bigger picture here, one that connects these small, repeated spikes to something many people in the 50 to 75 range are already paying close attention to: their heart health. Research referenced in The Lancet has explored how repeated elevations in blood sugar over time may be associated with changes in blood vessel function, particularly the inner lining of the arteries, known as the endothelium. This lining plays a role in how smoothly blood flows and how blood vessels respond to everyday demands. Here's the analogy that tends to make this click. Imagine a garden hose that's flexible and smooth on the inside when it's new. Now imagine that over years of exposure to certain conditions, the inside of that hose gradually becomes a little rougher, a little stiffer, not broken, not blocked, just different than it used to be. Water still flows through it, but the hose itself has changed. That's roughly the idea here. It's not that one snack causes a dramatic event. It's that repeated blood sugar elevations, the kind we've been discussing with figs, sweetened cranberries, and trail mix, may, according to clinical models, be one of several factors that contribute to gradual changes in how blood vessels function over time. This is precisely why the silent framing matters so much. These aren't changes most people can feel happening in real time. There's no alarm bell, just a slow, cumulative process that connects what's on your plate today to how your cardiovascular system may be functioning years down the road. Now, here's the encouraging part. And this is where the conversation shifts. Because if certain dried fruits can contribute to this pattern, there are other foods in this same category that clinical observations suggest may actually work in the opposite direction. And the first one might surprise you because it's something most people walk past in the grocery store without a second thought. Number 6. Here's where things start to shift in a more encouraging direction. And this first one is something most people have probably seen in a mixed nut container without ever thinking much about it. Brazil nuts are large, slightly wrinkled, and often the ones people pick around or leave for last in a bag of mixed nuts. But Harvard Medical School has highlighted selenium, a trace mineral found in notably high amounts in Brazil nuts, as playing a supportive role in thyroid function, and thyroid health has a meaningful connection to how the body manages energy and metabolic processes overall. Here's the analogy that helps this make sense. Think of your thyroid as a thermostat for your metabolism. Selenium is one of several nutrients that may help support that thermostat in functioning the way it's designed to. When that system is well supported, it can have ripple effects on energy levels, weight regulation, and how efficiently the body processes what you eat. What makes Brazil nuts particularly interesting is how little of them is needed. Unlike dried fruit, where the safe amount can be easy to overshoot, Brazil nuts are typically discussed in terms of just 1 or 2 per day, because selenium, while supportive in appropriate amounts, doesn't require large quantities to potentially offer benefit. This is also a helpful example of something we've touched on throughout this video. It's not about eating more health food in general, it's about understanding which specific foods in which specific amounts may align with what your body needs. Now, pause for a moment here. If you've been skipping over Brazil nuts in your nut mix without realizing what they offer, this might be the moment that changes how you look at that bag the next time you reach for it. But Brazil nuts aren't the only overlooked option. There's another category entirely, something small, often sprinkled rather than snacked on, that may offer similar metabolic support in a completely different way. Number 7. This next category often gets overlooked for a simple reason. Most people think of seeds as a garnish, not a snack. Something sprinkled on a salad or a bowl of oatmeal, not something to reach for on its own. But pumpkin seeds and sunflower seeds share something in common that's worth paying attention to. They're both notable sources of magnesium, and research discussed in JAMA has examined magnesium's role in supporting normal insulin function. Insulin being the hormone responsible for helping move sugar out of the bloodstream and into cells where it can be used for energy. Here's the analogy that helps this land. Think of insulin as a key, and the cells in your body as locked doors. Magnesium appears to play a supportive role in how smoothly that key turns in the lock. When magnesium levels are well supported, that process may tend to run a little more efficiently, according to clinical models examining this relationship. What makes these seeds particularly practical is how easily they fit into an existing routine. A small spoonful of pumpkin seeds on a salad, a sprinkle of sunflower seeds on yogurt, even a small handful eaten on their own as an afternoon snack. Unlike dried fruit, where portion control requires real attention, seeds tend to be naturally self-limiting. They're filling in small amounts, and few people find themselves absent-mindedly eating handful after handful the way they might with something sweet. There's something almost poetic about this contrast. The dried fruits we discussed earlier, figs, sweetened cranberries, trail mix, are often eaten in larger amounts precisely because they taste like a treat. Seeds, by comparison, are eaten in smaller amounts precisely because they don't try to be one. And according to the patterns we've discussed today, that difference may matter more than most people realize. So now we've covered the foods themselves. what to watch for, and what to consider adding. But knowing the information is only half the equation. The real question is, how do you apply this the next time you're standing in front of your pantry? That's exactly what we're covering next. Number 8. So let's bring everything together into something simple. Something you can actually use the next time you're standing in your kitchen deciding what to reach for. The American Diabetes Association has long emphasized that practical, repeatable habits tend to be far more sustainable than rigid rules. And that's exactly the spirit behind this. Not a list of forbidden foods. Just 3 quick questions that take a few seconds to ask yourself. Question 1. Is this dried or is this fresh? As we covered earlier, drying concentrates sugar into a smaller space. If a fresh version of the fruit is available, that's often the gentler choice for blood sugar, simply because of portion and water content. Question 2. Does the label mention anything added? Words like sweetened, with added sugar, or infused with juice concentrate are clues. Plain dried fruit with no additions is a different food than its sweetened counterpart, even if they sit side by side on the same shelf. Question 3. Am I eating this alone or with something that slows it down? This is where Brazil nuts, pumpkin seeds, or sunflower seeds can play a role, not as a replacement, but as a pairing. A small amount of dried fruit alongside a source of healthy fat or protein tends to be handled differently by the body than that same dried fruit eaten on its own. Here's the analogy that ties it together. Think of these 3 questions like checking the weather before deciding what to wear. You're not avoiding going outside. You're just making a more informed choice about how to prepare for it. None of this requires perfection. It requires awareness. The same awareness we've built throughout this entire video, chapter by chapter. And that awareness is really the whole point. Not fear, not restriction, just a clearer picture of what's actually happening, so you can make choices that align with how you want to feel, today and years from now. So here's where we land. Dried fruit isn't the villain of this story, but it isn't the automatic safe snack many of us were taught to believe either. The truth sits somewhere in between, in the details. Which fruit, how it's prepared, how much, and what it's paired with. What we've walked through today, the silent accumulation behind your A1C, the concentration effect in figs, the hidden sugars in sweetened cranberries, the disguise of trail mix, and the quieter, more supportive role of Brazil nuts and seeds, isn't meant to make your pantry feel like a minefield. It's meant to give you something far more valuable, a clearer lens. I'm Dr. Rubio Santner, and what I've found again and again, working with people in exactly this stage of life, is that the smallest shifts, swapping one snack, asking one extra question before reaching into a bag, tend to compound just as quietly as the problems do, just in the other direction. And if today's video got you thinking differently about your pantry, there's one more place worth looking. Because the next video covers something sitting in almost every refrigerator in America, something most people pour over their cereal every single morning without a second thought. And it might be quietly working against everything we just talked about today.